Good morning. I'm Edward Montgomery, the Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy. I want to welcome you to the 2014 LEAD Conference entitled The Power of Opinion, How Americans' Preferences on Energy Point a Way Forward on Climate Change. The LEAD name stands for Leadership, Evidence, Analysis, and Debate. Four principles at the very heart of designing effective public policies. As policy professors and researchers, our mission at the McCourt School is to give our students the rigorous quantitative and analytical skills they need to do just that. LEAD highlights the important research conducted by our faculty and our research centers by bringing together key stakeholders to examine a particular policy challenge and foster dialogue on potential solutions. Last year, we gathered some of the foremost minds in economics to discuss the state of our economy and policies to help jumpstart both the U.S. and worldwide economic growth. At our inaugural conference, 350 practitioners and researchers from across the country came to Georgetown's campus for a two-day discussion focused on outcomes to improve the lives of at-risk youth and children. Today, we will attempt to address the complex questions of energy policy and climate change. I'm proud to be part of a community producing such powerful ideas and promoting dialogue on such a diverse set of society's most pressing challenges. Our third annual LEAD conference features the work of McCourt Associate Professor David Kaniski and his research partner, Harvard Stephen Anasola Bahir. My apologies. For the past 10 years, they have asked some very straightforward and pointed questions of the American public. Well, which energy sources do Americans prefer and why? Why does the public support, or does it support further development of coal, natural gas, nuclear power, and alternative energy sources such as solar and wind? What trade-offs between the economic costs and environmental harms are people willing to make? The results of their study were recently published in a book, Clean and Cheap, How Americans Think About Energy in the Age of Global Warming, which you can buy at a discount upstairs while we're at break or at lunch. This research paints the first comprehensive picture of how Americans think about energy. We are honored to have the Honorable Gina McCarthy, the Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, as our keynote speaker. Administrator McCarthy, who has spent more than 30 years in public service, operating at both the local, state, and federal levels, has held a variety of very distinguished positions before becoming the administrator, including the Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Air and Radiation under President Obama, and as Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Environmental Protection. She holds a BA in Social Anthropology and a Master's in Environmental Health Engineering, Planning, and Policy. Administrator McCarthy has worked for both Republican and Democrats across the aisle. She's worked and built ties with industry and environmental community, and she's been lauded for her pragmatism, openness, and integrity. She is at the very forefront of the Obama administration's effort to combat climate change through its Clean Power Plan and other policy initiatives, certainly a tough job in today's current political environment. The research that we're going to highlight today in Clean and Cheap shows that Americans think about energy and the environment mainly in terms of its effect on public health and the economy. Ambassador McCarthy often speaks in just these terms. We are pleased to have the administrator here to open today's discussion about a path forward towards a sustainable energy policy. Ambassador McCarthy, Administrator McCarthy, I want to thank you for being here today. While she makes her presentation, after she makes her presentation, we will have a time for a moderated Q&A. And so if you have questions, people will be going around collecting them from you in the aisles, and we'll have some time to ask some questions of the administrator when she is done. Please be sure to add your affiliation, your name and your school to your question. With that, let me introduce Ambassador McCarthy, and thank you for coming here today. We really appreciate it.
I think after you hear me speak, you'll realize that ambassador doesn't quite suit my style. They're much more politically correct. Well, let me begin first by thanking Dean Montgomery and thanks to the School of Public Policy for hosting today. I'm excited. The day looks like it's going to be great for everybody. I know that it may seem like every other week I'm here at Georgetown. That's probably true because you host a lot of great events and you're doing some great things. And I'm sure many of you are getting tired of hearing from me. Well, tough. You have a little bit of time to put up with me this morning. But I know that there is, again, a great day planned. But before I talk a little bit about the energy and environmental future, which is the topic of today, I thought I'd share a little lessons from the past, if we could, because I've had some history in this issue. And most of you probably don't remember, as I do, lucky you, because you weren't around in the 60s. But if you remember back in the 60s, our industries and our businesses were growing. Our suburbs were sprawling up, and the automobile was the symbol of the American dream. At that point in time, it was a chicken in every pot and a car in every driveway. The auto industry actually was setting the pace for the American economy. Well, unfortunately, in the 60s, our rivers were also burning. We were creating lovely little Superfund sites that were popping up all over the country. And the smokestacks were burning, spewing out black soot. And our cars were fueled by leaded gasoline. And so all this progress was really terrific from an economic standpoint, but folks began to realize that the cost of that economic progress was a bit too high. Sure, leaded gasoline was affordable and it was reliable, but its full cost didn't show up at the pump. And what we saw was toxic leaded gas fumes and other pollutants were choking our cities. They were impairing public health. Lead fumes even threatened brain development in our kids. That was the price of progress that folks realized was just too much to pay. So millions of people demanded cleaner fuels from their cars, and EPA responded. Despite special interests disputing the science, and as always, disputing the costs, EPA phased out leaded gas. Since EPA was created, and that was more than 40 years ago, technology innovations like catalytic converters that are now all in every vehicle, they have allowed us to drive cars that now run 99% cleaner than they did back in the 60s. That same success story that involves science as well as innovation has been repeated over and over through the history of EPA over the past 40 years as we've tackled the most pressing environmental challenges in ways that have sparked American ingenuity. And it's led to a United States environmental industry, technology industry that is really second to none. This is all about growing the economy and cleaning the environment. It's progress we can all share in. So if there's one lesson we should learn, and we should have learned by now, is that real economic progress, and in terms of today, real energy progress, never comes at the price of economic growth, and it should never result in increased health risks. There are ways in which we can move forward because it comes actually from investing in cleaner, more efficient technologies that keep people healthy. We've figured it out for 40 years. There's no reason why we can't continue. So we understand that today's climate change issue is actually the most complex energy and environmental challenge that we have perhaps ever faced. It's also the most significant public health challenge. But like always, we can turn that challenge into a tremendous opportunity, an opportunity to reinvigorate the way we make and we use energy, because we have not been investing in the energy world for decades in the way that the United States should be investing. So under President Obama's leadership, EPA is using this opportunity to really seize momentum. And just like before, despite the naysayers and all the special interests that tend to pop up when regulatory issues arise, the people of the United States actually get it. They know the costs of climate inaction is too high. They know we can, and they know we must. make energy clean, efficient, and affordable. Now, the research from David and Stephen's new book, Cheap and Clean, underscores that truth. And I'm well aware that people say, don't judge a book by its cover, but frankly, the title says way too much, people may not buy it. Clean power isn't just about protecting public health. It's also about protecting people's pocketbooks. That's the point I really want to make clear. Clean energy means less pollution. Clean energy means lower costs to our health, and it means lower cost to our economy. Those costs are always difficult to capture, and they're never included in the line item that people see on their bills. But they are real nevertheless. As temperatures and seas rise, so do insurance premiums, food prices, medical bills, and many more. And taxpayers and businesses, they pay the price. The American people get this. They understand the facts from all of the recent public opinion work out there on climate change. What stands out to me most is this. First, people overwhelmingly consider climate change to be a problem, and they want action, not more debate or discussion. And second, what's even more impressive is that we see overwhelming support, specifically for EPA action to curb carbon pollution from power plants. Now that is music to my ears. Because just like with cars, the public sentiment that our energy should be clean and affordable is not new, but it is essential for us to move forward. History shows that this is the kind of challenge that we have successfully faced time and again. Just take a look. Over the last 40 years, we've cut air pollution by 70%. While our economy has tripled in size. And we did it without skyrocketing energy costs. And today, even though we have common sense standards to regulate mercury and arsenic and NOx and SOx and all the range of pollutants, there are no limits on harmful carbon pollution that is fueling climate change. That has to be corrected. And where we begin is where the pollution is the largest. That is our power sector. That's why President Obama directed EPA to act. First, we did light-duty vehicles. Then we moved to heavy-duty vehicles. And a month ago, the president stood up and reinvested in what we're doing today, which is moving forward on our power plant regulations. Because at the UN summit, the president said, and I quote, "We cannot condemn our future, our children's future, beyond their capacity to a future." I'm sorry, let me start that over again. What did he say? "We cannot condemn our children to a future beyond their capacity to repair. Not when we have the means to begin repairing it right now." Now that was a critical statement. It wasn't just a regulatory issue or an issue of leadership. It was a moral statement, and it was a statement indicating that today we have the solutions we need, not just the problem identified. Because EPA's Clean Power Plan represents that same level of understanding. It is a common sense path forward to make the power sector clean while we keep energy affordable, efficient, and reliable. We've had well over already 1 million comments on our plan. And we extended the comment period through December 1st because people keep wanting to talk. I love it. This is the way democracy is supposed to work. It's engaging, it's invigorating, and the conversations have been tremendously positive. Because our Clean Power Plan will cut pollution from the power sector 30% by 2030 over 2005 baseline. And when we cut pollution, we reduce harmful pollutants that are contributing to traditional problems like smog and soot, things that mean a lot to American families today. From those reductions alone, every dollar we invest in our Clean Power Plan will return $7 in health benefits. In 2030, listen to these numbers, total climate and health benefits could reach up to $93 billion. $93 billion. And here's the thing. The energy efficiency measures that our plan helps to put in place by 2030 will actually result in energy bills being 8% cheaper than they are today. So look at the benefits and look at what we can do if we work together. And it's easy to see why climate action really makes sense today. The energy landscape is changing. EPA's plan looks at where we are today, and it maps out where we think the states are heading and the United States is heading in its energy mix. And we want to raise the common denominator for cleaner, affordable power across every state. This is not a one-size-fits-all prescription that you can often see through a regulatory process. It actually boosts progress underway in companies that are already happening in city halls, at state capitals across the nation. 38 states already have renewable energy portfolio standards, and 10 states already have market-based programs that deal with greenhouse gas emissions. Clean energy is getting cheaper by the minute. The price of utility-scale solar power is almost 60% below where analysts predicted it would be. And between 2012 and 2013, the price of solar power installed on homes or local businesses dropped 12 to 15%. Solutions are here today to get this important ball rolling. And according to a report from the Carbon Disclosure Project, companies like Delta, Google, and Disney, they already internalize carbon price in their business decisions. What is taking us so long, folks? That was the other impressive thing about being at the UN conference a month ago. It wasn't talking heads from government, it was businesses saying, I'm actually doubling down on how I look at this. I am factoring this into my business decisions. This matters for me in my business across the world, not just in the United States. It was the first time I have left one of those meetings optimistic, actually way optimistic. And it's the first time I've realized just how important the United States is in terms of the leadership we can provide, because the optimism, much of it, was revolving around this president and this administration taking the kind of action that we need to take. Now, the key to making our Clean Power Plan ambitious and making sure that it's available for every state to step up is the flexibility that we provided, because flexibility allows states to choose their own low-carbon path forward while we look at each of the states and try to determine how far we think they can go. It allows them to design their plans in a way that makes sense for their own energy needs and for their own economy. That's how this will work. Flexibility means more choices for them in more ways that they can invest. Not lower costs, but actually invest. Our plan sends a powerful market signal that will unleash innovation, and it will create jobs. And that innovation will lead to even more affordable clean power. It's a positive cycle that we should do everything we can to move forward and to encourage. You know, I was recently at a clean tech incubator in Los Angeles, and it was so much fun because those companies are growing and creating the jobs that really will bring market certainty to this effort. We are providing a long-term path for investment to happen, and we are already seeing innovation being spurred. If we can just continue to send this signal and be strong in the United States, we will be able to take a leadership position and position the United States to be successful in the quest for the technologies that address climate today and those that will continue to address that in our future. Now that's the real prize that I take home when I think about regulatory action, because I don't regulate to drive regulation. It's not fun. I regulate to drive markets. That's fun. I regulate to tell people the full cost of what we're doing and allow the people to make choices about how what we do have always done actually can continue to happen, which is you reduce those public health impacts, you protect the environment so we can have a healthy world to live in, and at the same time you find ways to grow the economy and jump out in front and grow the technologies and the businesses of the future. You know, decades ago, when American cities were choked by smog, we knew we had the technology to begin to fix the problem. And we knew American ingenuity would carry us forward. And it has. So let's continue to have that courage. All we needed was to nudge the market in the right direction, to embrace cleaner energy, and to run with it. And that's what actually happened in the past. There's no reason to think, if we have that same courage, that it won't continue to happen again. We sent a signal flare by making policy that protected public health. That signal drove markets, drove innovation, cleaned up our cars, and served the US up as a model for the rest of the world. That is what we must do with the challenge of climate change. And because we took action, our kids won't grow up breathing toxic leaded fumes. Let's make the world safe for our children again. That's what we can do. That's what we must do. We must embrace the challenge of climate the way we have embraced our challenges before. It is not just a responsibility that we have to accept as regulators. It's a moral responsibility we must all embrace for the sake of our kids. And let's remember that this isn't a challenge. It's as much an opportunity as it is a challenge. This is an opportunity for us to seize the day. It's an opportunity for us to retool and resurge with new technologies, new industries, and new jobs. This is, folks, our catalytic converter moment. As we work to build a cleaner, low-carbon energy future, let's remind ourselves just how good we are at this and how much our capabilities will build over time. Thank you very much.
So we have a few questions from the audience. Let me start off with, what is the main obstacle you see to moving forward successfully to implement the Clean Power Plan? And what can we do to help?
I think that thank you for the question. And hi, everybody. The main obstacle really is just to continue the dialogue and to keep it as healthy as it's been. I think that the way that we like to do rulemaking is the way that this rule is being done, which is total immersion and engagement. We are seeing incredible rolling up their sleeves of both the energy and environmental world. It is challenging, but our issue is to make sure that we can get it done, which we will, and our plan is still to shoot for a June timeline of next year for a final, but it's to make sure that we can continue to listen. We want this to be a table that we set for every single state in the United States. Now, we recognize that this rule is not going to get us everywhere we need to go, but I think that we're going to do exactly what we've done in the past, is when you have a big problem, you get out of the starting gate as fast as you can. You keep your goal in mind. Where's the finish line? And then you start to be as creative in generating momentum as you possibly can. So for me, it's to continue what we're doing, which is we're going to keep doing outreach until the day this thing is signed, and we are going to continue to have positive momentum, I think, and reach out to people.
Okay. The transition to clean energy, while not hurting the economy overall, may create pockets of economic dislocation and stagnation in certain regions of the country. Yeah. How can the government supplement EPA's policy to minimize those impacts?
That's a really good question. You know, one of the reasons why we formed this as such a flexible approach is because we wanted to make sure to recognize that every state isn't positioned the same. its energy mix is different, its economy is fueled differently. And so what we tried to do in this plan in terms of how the plan itself recognized this is we did individual state plans for that reason. We understood that states that were heavily invested in coal and reliant on those with less ability to transition and to think about options for lower carbon sources would take a while to be able to ramp up, while there were other states that were already in the game and moving forward. So we tried to design this in a way that was reasonable and affordable for every state. And part of the question is, how do we continue the dialogue to make sure that we were being as aggressive as we should be, and also recognizing that we have leadership states that have gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit already. And so we try to design it that way. And the second issue is we need to recognize that, for example, the coal mining industry and the coal industry has been in some difficulty regardless of whether this rule moves forward. And the difficulty I'm referring to is that it's just coal as a fuel source for power plants is really not competitive in most of the United States. In fact, EIA isn't projecting new coal facilities being constructed for decades for that very reason. And it's not going to get easier for those states that are heavily reliant on the coal industry to really not only put bread on their tables, but their communities. And I think we all recognize that. And the president has appointed a liaison to work with these communities to understand how the federal government can provide support for the transition that is already ongoing and regardless of this rule will continue, and how we can position them to find jobs and job growth in these new areas where the United States is going to really be seeing its future.
Here's a provocative one. Wouldn't a carbon tax or fee with a dividend program reduce carbon emissions and help you address your across sectors, not just in the power plant sector?
Well, here's the point. Here's the issue. What you're pointing at is basically strategies that are available to the United States Congress to move forward. The president relied pretty heavily on trying to work with Congress in the first term, and he will continue certainly to work with Congress as we move forward. But that approach didn't really yield the kind of finish line that we were hoping to have in terms of getting action taken. So the president at this point is just recognizing that while Congress is stalled, we have the ability to move forward. We have shown through, I think now 3 or 4 Supreme Court decisions that carbon is a pollutant that's regulated under the Clean Air Act, that we have responsibilities already as an administration and certainly as EPA to move forward. So the president is going to take action through the Clean Air Act to continue to lower carbon pollution that's fueling this climate change. And we're also going to continue to reach out to Congress, because if Congress wants to take this up, we think there are perhaps much more comprehensive approaches that could be done. An example are the ones that you mentioned.
We have a representative from GU Fossil Fuels and wanted to ask you how important, both symbolically and otherwise, you find successful divestment campaigns in promoting alternate energy sources and so forth.
Well, I think the goal that I have certainly is my job is to, I think, to try to turn climate being something that people have been afraid to recognize into something that they really want to take up as a challenge, and will hopefully, and I think history shows us, get us much more solutions that will ensure our success here and change the international debate. I think the campaign to look at divestments is great. That doesn't mean that I'm going to make decisions for universities on how best to step up. My basic goal is to get every community, every individual, every family, every religious institution, every public entity really stepping up and thinking about what they could do that benefits them and that will move forward on climate change. And as you can probably tell from the rule we did, I'm not going to decide how best they react to that challenge. I think it's entirely up to the individual institutions or communities and their own stakeholders. There is so much that we can do. There are a portfolio of approaches that you can take. Pick from one. The most important thing is you stand up and speak to the science, which I know this university and many others do. I just was 2 days ago at a luncheon at the Georgetown Climate Center, which I was sort of instrumental in helping to form about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's been miraculous. The commitment is there and the work is ongoing. So everybody has to choose their path forward that's best for them. They certainly don't need the federal government to dictate that.
I have an ethics professor who says a common criticism from environmentalists is that clean and cheap is a contradiction, and we should be going for more significant reductions than EPA is offering. How do you respond to that?
That is a surprise. No, it's not. That was a joke. You know, we work with constituencies, whether they're the ones that say climate is not happening and it will shut down the economy if we take any interest in looking at things like efficiency or renewables, all the way to folks that on the environmental side, which vision a different future and think we can do that tomorrow. And so that's the balance in the United States. That's the balance we work with always. I respect everybody's opinion, but my job is really to do what my authority is under the law and my responsibility under the law. And I try to adhere to that, but listen to all sides. And I get frustrated by both approaches, but we work it through, and in the end, you get a rule that's legally solid. And you get reductions that are as aggressive as you can be while making sure that it's reasonable and affordable. That's my goal here, and that's what I'm sticking to. So I hang out just as much with the people that annoy me on each side, and they know I listen, and frankly, I learn from both. There are always going to be these positions that folks take. You know, everybody thinks if they're way out on the right, I got to be way out on the left. Frankly, maybe they do. Maybe they do. I've always been just the listener of both sides and the one that tries to get the best result.
Okay. International question says the EU has now worked on their 2030 climate goals, which they consider themselves important new targets and players in this. What do you think about the EU's role in international climate, or how do you think about both what we're doing in the intersection with other countries?
Yeah, that's great. You know, I am just so thankful that the president came to Georgetown University, you know, what was that, about a year and a half ago? Yep. And gave the speech he gave on climate, because it was the launch of the President's Climate Action Plan, which really was about let's tackle our domestic reductions here so that we can mitigate the future challenges associated with continued emissions. Let's take a look at adaptation, resilience in our communities. And the last one was, let's provide the leadership we need to leverage a better international conversation. So I really think that what Europe is doing is very Europe. It's what they do, but it's great. It is exactly what they need to do to send a signal. But again, I couldn't be more encouraged by the response that we are seeing in the general public in the United States over stopping the discussion about the science and really getting into the nitty-gritty of what do we do here? Like the U.S. always leads, why aren't we leading on this one? But it also is really showing up in the tone and tenor of the international discussions. I have never had more people want to talk to me from different ministries ever, saying, are you really going to do this? Is this really going to happen? And I say yes and yes. And they see the leadership, and it is changing the international dynamic on this, which needs to be changed. The other question, we've heard a lot about the rhetoric of a Clean Power Plan penalizing states like Massachusetts that have already invested heavily in the energy efficiency. Do you have a response to that criticism? Since I'm from Massachusetts, I can say, win, 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 win. No. Well, we've heard that, and from not just Massachusetts, but a number of states, just to recognize the fact that they have been out in front. I think the dynamic we need to keep is an understanding that And this does not diminish what the leading states have done. And I worked in Massachusetts, I worked in Connecticut, I helped form the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. We knew that we were providing leadership here, but we also knew, because we had tested these things out, that renewable energy was actually good to get into the system. We knew that energy efficiency was saving us money. We knew that if we took RGGI proceeds and put it to investing in energy efficiency programs, it was going to lower demand and it was going to clean the air at the same time as it was going to lower carbon emissions. And we actually knew that it was going to grow businesses in our states. And lo and behold, that's exactly what it did. So we're not asking for continued sacrifice. We're asking for continued ingenuity. We're asking for continued creativity. And while we're taking a look at whether or not we are asking too much of states that went out in front, and we're also looking at maybe we asked too little for others, though both of those criticisms have been waged, and we'll have those conversations. But frankly, I think the states who did this knew that this was not a risk to them for their economy. It was actually a chance for them to get ahead and to do the right thing for their families, and to also do the right thing for their economy. And I've been very pleased with the way it's worked out. And if they keep thinking that creatively, they're going to get to the goal that we've set, and they're going to get way past that. And that's kind of the fun of the work that I do, because it's not only the states that worry about that they can do it, and legitimately, and we'll take a look at it, but the utility industry has traditionally been extremely confrontational and challenging in the regulatory process, which I just love. It's just I just love it. Because it's fun, it's engaging, it's what it's supposed to be. If you don't like confrontation, please don't go into public service. Democracy is all about that. It's fun. Everybody has different opinions. But what I love about the utility industry is when the gun sounds and the rule's done, they run. They've already figured out, I can make money on this even though I'm complaining, because they know you're going to make them do something. So they start thinking about how to do it. They think about how to develop a market. They think about whether their business model is right. And if you see the discussion at the table today, it is as fundamental right now. They are already having conversations that used to wait for the final gun to be fired. And they always go further. They always do better. And I think we are at a time when the energy world is transforming. I think they know that. They've been thinking about it for a long time. We did this Clean Power Plan with the flexibility so that you could ride that transformation, not drive it, ride it. And the conversations are great. The utilities are engaged. And I see us making a significant leap forward over the next few years in confronting what I know to be the biggest public health, economic, national security challenge of our time.
Well, I know that you have an incredibly busy schedule, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Would you join me in thanking the administrator for the remarks?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I want to thank again the Administrator McCarthy, and now we're going to move to the next section of today's program. I want to introduce our hosts for the next session, our Professor David Kaniski from the McCourt School and Harvard Professor Stephen Ansola-Baher, who will give us some more in-depth overview of their research and take some of your questions as we move to the next panel. David?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the McCourt School's 2014 LEAD conference. It was terrific to have Administrator McCarthy here with us today for a really inspiring talk and to start and sort of kick off today's discussion. I expect that we'll return to many of these themes throughout the day. So Steve and I are especially excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of our work. But before I do that, and before I turn to our presentation, allow me to take a few minutes to personally acknowledge a few people that made this event possible. First, I'd like to thank Dean Montgomery for supporting today's event and for his overall leadership of the McCourt School. Second, of course, I'd like to thank Administrator McCarthy and her team at the EPA for their participation, as well as the participation of all of our expert panelists that are joining us today. And finally, I want to give special recognition to Lauren Mullins, who is Director of Communications here at the McCourt School. This event has been in the planning for many months, and it simply could not have happened without Lauren's hard work and commitment and that of her entire staff. So please take a moment and help me thank them with some applause. As Dean Montgomery mentioned, Steve and I recently completed a decade-long project looking at how Americans think about energy. In general, we have come to the conclusion that Americans want energy to be less expensive, and they want it to be less harmful to human health and the environment. In other words, they want their energy to be both cheap and clean, which also happens to be the title of our book. The conundrum, of course, is that at the present time, at least as we conventionally understand it, cheap sources of energy are not very clean, and clean sources of energy are not very cheap. So with this in mind, our goal this morning is to explain how we've come to this conclusion and what we think it means for future climate policy. To get us started, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Steve Van Solbeher. Steve is Professor of Government at Harvard and is a widely recognized expert in many areas of political science, including congressional elections, campaign finance, mass media, and of course, public opinion. Prior to Harvard, Steve was at MIT, which is important to mention because our research is very much a product of MIT, for reasons that Steve will now explain. So Steve, welcome, and the podium is yours.
This book is a very personal journey for me. In 2002, I was working on the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. I normally study elections. I don't normally venture into the field of energy. I knew very little about it before this project began. And Paul Joskow, who's now head of the Sloan Foundation, and Richard Lester, who's a nuclear engineer, came to me with a problem and an invitation. And the invitation was to join a new study, a study on nuclear power and the future of nuclear power that was being led by Ernie Moniz, who's now the Secretary of Energy, and John Deutsch, who had been the provost at MIT and the head of the CIA. And these were all very, very prominent people at MIT and around the country, and I thought, well, this is very important, so I should listen to what they need and do whatever I can. They wanted me and David to help them understand public attitudes about nuclear power. And this was interesting because in the public opinion research, energy and environment questions are kind of secondary. Usually when you ask the most important problem facing the country, the environment shows up around 20. Energy is usually not on the list unless there's some sort of crisis, such as an oil embargo. Their proposal, and what they wanted to help understanding, was a significant expansion in nuclear power given the problem of global warming. So given global warming, should the United States radically expand its nuclear portfolio? We were intrigued and we listened further, and the reason that they'd come to us was that their own advisory committee said that they were putting the cart before the horse, that the United States public wouldn't go for a significant expansion of nuclear power because the public simply didn't want it. And so the study would have been dead on arrival if they'd gone to the White House with it, which they eventually did. How big was their expansion? They wanted to build 300 new nuclear power plants around the United States by 2050. That's 6 a year, starting from the date of the study. There are 100 nuclear power plants in the United States currently. This seemed to us a fool's errand, and we gladly signed on. As David said, a real theme emerged, but it emerged organically. This was not something we were looking for. We weren't trying to prove a hypothesis or put forth a certain theory of the way that people think about this world. In fact, what we were mostly intrigued with was the discussions inside the committee were focused on nuclear waste, on sabotage and national security problems, on proliferation and cost. Environmental questions had very little to do with any of the internal discussions of the group. We did a survey for the group, and David will explain more about what that survey produced. The survey really started from scratch, though, because what we discovered in 2002 was that for the previous 30 years, or 25 years since the oil crisis, the question of energy in the United States and the public's attitudes about energy had been completely neglected by my field, which was a bit of a stunner that we would not ask about it. There was a time series that the Cambridge Research Associates, Energy Research Associates, they were renamed, had done that monitored public support for building new nuclear power plants, but no one asked about coal, no one asked about natural gas, no one asked about oil and support for those commodities. We didn't know whether support for nuclear power was greater or less than support for coal, or greater or less than support for oil or nuclear power, natural gas, or for solar and wind power. Almost nothing was known about how much people wanted, and less was known about why people wanted what they wanted. What was the driver? Was it global warming that was driving public attitudes about nuclear power? Was it concern about safety? Was it concern about cost? Was it any of the things that were happening inside that room of the nuclear study group? So we conducted a survey, and David will tell you much more about that survey. But the theme emerged from that survey that what people really want is they want energy that's relatively low cost and energy that's relatively clean in terms of local environmental harms. The nuclear study became another study 2 years later, the coal study, and then the natural gas study, and then an energy innovation study, and a solar study. And through those studies, we developed a series of surveys, all of which showed the same theme again and again, that people want cheap and clean energy, and the difficult question is how they strike the balance between those in terms of solving immediate problems like an expansion of nuclear power, what do we do about coal, how do we embrace solar power, and ultimately how do we deal with global warming. There was one result that I'll tell you before I give the floor back to David that was something of a showstopper. Sorry, I should have. And that was that there was no correlation, or even a negative correlation, between concern about global warming and support for nuclear power. That is, if we take that at its face, the American public was not going to be driven by concern about global warming to embrace nuclear power. And for the engineers and the scientists in the room, that was a very upsetting result, because that meant that the public was ultimately not with them. Not only did they not want a significant expansion in nuclear power, but the very reason for the study, global warming, was not going to generate the kind of support for the kinds of policies that they wanted. So this journey for us ultimately became a quest for answering the question that Gina McCarthy put forward, which was, how do we move forward? How does the public move forward? How do experts move forward? And can we bring things together? So let me pass the floor to David, and he'll tell you more about what we did.
Great, thanks, Steve. So let's get into the data a little bit. So I want to present answers to two basic questions. What energy sources do Americans want the country to use, and why do they want us to use them? So what do Americans want? So our research clearly shows that people want a different portfolio of energy sources than we have today. Americans want much less reliance in use of coal and oil, more reliance on renewable technologies, especially solar and wind. They'd like to keep natural gas at about the same level, perhaps increase it a little bit, and they are deeply divided on nuclear power. So these basic findings are illustrated in the following two graphs, which summarize responses to a question we regularly have included on our surveys. The question in essence asks people to indicate whether they want the United States to increase or decrease the use of different energy sources for generating electricity. So the first graph is looking at fossil fuels. And as you can clearly see, regarding, for example, coal, there is a majority of the public who like to see us either reduce or even not use at all coal as a way to generate power. Whereas only a very small, or about 15–20% of the public would like us to see an increase in the use of coal for generating electricity. The story for natural gas is a little bit more mixed. In general, people have a little more divided. They would like to see us increase use of natural gas to a little bit higher degree, and there's less who are in opposition or like to see us reduce it. And finally, looking at oil, you see a much bigger green section, which is the reduced category. And in essence, although we don't really use too much oil for generating electricity, the general thought of oil is not something people are that enthusiastic about and like to see us reduce it quite a bit. If we turn to nuclear power and other alternatives, we see with nuclear power a pretty even distribution in the public across the years of our surveys. There is a very strong opposition among some in the public regarding nuclear power, many not wanting to use it at all, certainly many who would like us to reduce it, and maybe about a quarter of the population who's on the other side and would like to see some sort of increase. If you look at solar and wind, you should be, at least I'm struck by the amount of blue, right, which is the amount of the public saying they'd like to increase it. Generally speaking, in our surveys, somewhere around 75 to 80% of the public, this is across years, want to see a big increase in the use of renewable technologies. So Americans' preferences about these energy sources really have not changed too much over the decade, with a couple of exceptions. Natural gas probably being the most evident. People generally want to see an increase in natural gas as we move forward. So the second question, and perhaps the more interesting question, is why is this? So the driving force behind Americans' energy choices is their perceptions of the attributes or characteristics of the energy sources themselves. Which is to say, people are not anti-coal or pro-coal, they're not anti-solar or pro-solar. They instead hold these preferences because of how they view the attributes of these sources. And it turns out that two attributes matter the most. First is the local environmental impact or harm that they associate with using an energy source. So think air pollution or water pollution or the generation of toxic waste. And second is economic cost. These two factors trump everything else. Once you account for perceptions of these attributes, factors like partisanship or educational background, income, where you live, barely matter. And of particular importance for our discussion today, concern about climate change is also a relatively unimportant factor in explaining these preferences. So let me say a little bit more about how we reach these conclusions. So first, in our surveys, we have repeatedly asked people to indicate the degree of environmental harm that they associate with different energy sources. We find that on average, Americans tend to perceive coal, oil, nuclear power to have the most significant environmental impacts. They see natural gas as being only slightly harmful to the environment, and they view, perhaps not surprisingly, renewable sources to be not harmful at all. So in general then, people tend to get the relative harms correct. In terms of perception of cost, Americans tend to view wind and solar as being very inexpensive or very cheap. They see coal, natural gas, and hydropower as moderately priced, and oil and nuclear power as expensive. So on cost, Americans are mostly right. People tend to drastically underestimate the cost of renewable energy. This was particularly true when we began our survey work back in the early 2000s. So here's what we find in a little more detail here. So these graphs show some results from statistical analysis in which we estimate the importance or weight of the perceptions of local environmental impact, economic cost, and climate change concern. I should note that environmental harm and economic costs are coded in these graphs such that higher values represent less perceived harm and less perceived cost, while global warming is coded such that higher values indicate more concern. So there are a couple of points I'd like to highlight. First, the perception of environmental harm matters the most when people evaluate energy choices. While Americans want energy to be both cheap and clean, they place more weight on local environmental impacts than they do on how much using an energy source costs. This pattern is consistent for the 7 energy sources which we look at, including the 4 displayed here. And with a couple of exceptions, the pattern is relatively stable over the course of the decade of our research. We can infer from this that when forced to make a trade-off, people will choose cleaner energy over cheaper energy. A second point to highlight is that people's energy choices are not strongly related to their concerns about climate change. In fact, in many of our surveys, concern about climate change is uncorrelated with people's energy choices. Stated simply, Americans' energy choices are generally not being driven by their level of concern about climate change. So this has started to change a little bit. In our most recent surveys, concerns about global warming do help explain support for wind and solar power, as well as opposition to coal and oil. But, and this is an important but, the weight of climate change concern still lags behind weights of perceived local environmental impacts and economic costs. So this is not the end of the story, though, when it comes to understanding the role of people's energy preferences in climate policy. And for the rest of that story, I'm going to turn things back over to Steve. Thanks.
So around 2006, the surveys we were doing started to change because the problems started to change. The MIT Energy Studies had run through a cycle of different fuel sources, which was very much organized around how DOE thinks about energy, like there's this fuel source, there's this fuel source, there's this fuel source. But none of it was pointing to a way forward. None of it was pointing to what's the policy prescription that the American public is willing to embrace that'll move us forward on the climate problem. And quite frankly, we felt pretty stuck, and it was a pretty depressing moment. It was around 2006. It just seemed like local environmental harms are going to drive things, costs are going to drive choices, and we're going to move forward with some energy path that's not necessarily the one that's going to get us to where we need to be to address the problems and challenges of climate change. Around this time, we started to ask some policy questions in our surveys, more pointedly about carbon taxes, cap and trade, and outright regulations such as the EPA might perform, and found, in terms of levels of support, depressingly low levels of support for any kind of effective policy. The median American would be willing to pay $5 more a month on his or her electricity bill in order to solve global warming, but not more. Okay, so that's the majority. The majority of the Americans were not willing to pay more than $5 more a month. The Kyoto Protocol, just to put it in perspective, the Kyoto Protocol, if you fully implemented it, would be about $25 more a month. That's a huge gap to make up. And in that context, it seemed like we weren't going to go anywhere. And about that time, I read a paper by my colleague Mike Greenstone and his associate Adam Looney that made the basic point that the price advantage of coal could be pretty much eliminated if you aggressively regulated mercury and other co-pollutants of climate change. And that would make the size of the carbon tax very small. And for me, this paper was a real aha moment, because up until this point, I had been thinking about climate change, Dave and I had been thinking about climate change as this isolated problem, separate from all the other environmental challenges. And what Mike and Adam were pointing out was that actually we should start thinking about climate change as part of an overall environmental strategy, regulating all the co-pollutants related to or tied to carbon emissions, such as mercury and black soot, that are big contributors to local environmental harms, local problems such as asthma, birth defects, or immediate problems that people could value today rather than some far-off problem that people would not value for a long time. So we started to examine the relationship between support for these different climate policies and concern about the various local immediate environmental factors associated with different energy sources. And what we found was that public support for different climate policies is mostly driven by their perceptions of local environmental harm associated with different fuels. It's not driven as much by concern about global warming. This was a huge surprise to us, that the way the American public thinks today about climate policy, things like carbon taxes or regulation of carbon, is in terms of the local environmental impact that those regulations might have if, say, they eliminated coal. So the public is making this link, rightly or wrongly. The link is there in their mind. And it's an important factor in the way the politics of this are starting to play out. Let me give you an anecdote, which is California Proposition 23. In 2009, California passed AB 32, Assembly Bill 32, which was the cap and trade system that the state of California was going to implement to try to reduce the carbon emissions of the state. The energy industry and some other organizations sponsored a proposition, and the debate began. And in 2010, the worst year for environmentalists electorally in recent history, the proponents of Assembly Bill 32 had to defend the cap and trade system against a very strong attack from the oil and gas industry in the form of Proposition 23. The attacks from the gas industry highlighted the basics. This is going to increase your electricity bill. This is going to hurt jobs in California. This is the midst of the recession. These are bread and butter issues that most Americans would immediately respond to. The defenders of AB 32 and the opponents of Prop 23 completely changed the rhetoric. They didn't mention global warming at all, even though that's what the legislation was about. For them, the campaign became all about, this is big oil coming in, and you saw that oil is the least popular of all of the fuel sources, and they emphasized that this will reduce smog in the state of California and other air pollution. So they turned it into a local pollution issue, and this was one of the few bright spots in 2010 for Democrats and environmentalists as Proposition 23 was turned back pretty soundly. This is an interesting story, sort of a proof of the pudding of what we were seeing in the polling data and what Adam and Mike had found in their own economic analyses, which is that the public ultimately wants kind of different approach. And this is when the path opened for what's the pathway forward. And that is to understand the linkages between carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases and other kinds of pollutants that we want to regulate today that have immediate health benefits and on a cost-benefit calculation can be justified to a regulatory agency. Regulate those co-pollutants immediately and take what we think is the indirect approach. It's sort of an indirect way of gaining the same benefits. The big lesson, though, is we should stop thinking about climate change in isolation. Greenhouse gases are linked to other pollutants, and experts and policymakers should take a more holistic approach to regulation. The public does. The public thinks that way, and that is our path forward. Okay.
So we had intended to take questions, and we're eager to do so, but we're also sensitive to our schedule. So if you have a really pressing question, you can come find us in the hallway, or we'll try to talk about it sometime later in the program. So I think at this moment, we're about to break for 15 minutes or so, and we'll reconvene for our first panel discussion at about 10:45 or so. So please enjoy some coffee outside, and we look forward to seeing you back in a little bit. Thanks.